I'm very excited and pleased to be able to welcome Ambassador Muñoz to Google in New York to talk about his new book on Pinochet. I looked quickly online before coming here because I was a little confused about pronunciation. We're going to have that clarified later on, but because for when I was growing up, it was always Pinochet, and then in the last few years it's been Pinochet. But we're gonna, however Ambassador Muñoz pronounces it later on, will be the Google standard for pronunciation. Um, uh, Ambassador Muñoz has had a pretty interesting and influential career. He served in the Allende government that was overthrown by Pinochet in the early 70s. And then during the Pinochet regime, actually was involved in the overthrow of Pinochet by an election in 1988 and his eventual leaving in 1990. And since then has spent time serving as ambassador to the UN, partly while Chile was on the Security Council. A pretty amazing career. The Pinochet story itself has fascinated me, and I'm sure many of you, because we all grew up during that regime in Chile and knew about it from a distance. As Ambassador Muñoz points out in his introduction, Pinochet is a household name, really, and stands in for a certain kind of dictator. Interesting, partly also because from a U.S. perspective, the CIA supported his coup. Milton Friedman in the Chicago School treated Chile as in a sense, an economic experiment. I just wanted to say that we don't wholeheartedly follow Friedman. We believe there is a free lunch. It's just upstairs on the 8th floor. But without further ado, I want to hand over to the ambassador and thank him again for coming to talk to us.
Okay. Thank you very much for this invitation. Since I, as many diplomats, have Googled and continue to Google every single day, so we have great respect for the work that you do. And I'm particularly thankful that you have invited me to speak about my book at a moment when I'm being told that the publishing industry is going down the drain and that books are going to be read in special artifacts, and we're going to lose the sense or feel of a book. I hope that isn't the case. So I thank you particularly for this invitation to speak about the Dictator's Shadow, which is a bit of a political memoir. But not only a personal political memoir, but perhaps a memoir of our times, of what has happened in my generation and in your generation, because the impact of what occurred in Chile was worldwide. I have met political leaders, I have met leaders of civil society throughout the world who tell me, well, I began my public career marching in the streets in solidarity with Chile and against the dictatorship of Pinochet. And that I have found in the strangest places, from Vietnam to Italy, passing through cities that you wouldn't suspect in the United States, to Europe and all places. And it is perhaps because what happened in Chile and Pinochet as a figure is one of the most important of the 20th century and marked the present 21st century. Because indeed, the names associated with Pinochet are so important to current history. Nixon, Kissinger, Milton Friedman, Jesse Helms. The first CIA director ever to be indicted in the history of the United States was Richard Helms. Richard Helms, precisely because he did not tell the full truth to an investigative committee of the Senate. But there are other names like Brezhnev or Fidel Castro linked to Pinochet in one way or another. So this is a book that tries to tell the story of Chile under the dictatorship, to transition to democracy, and how that story fit in the world of the late 20th century, particularly. And it was a book, let me confess, that I did not want to write. It was a executive vice president of Basic Books, who approached me and said that I should write the book because he knew my trajectory. And I said that I couldn't do it, and I wouldn't do it, because I said I'm not a biographer. I'm not a historian. But he said, no, I want your personal story. And through your personal story, tell us something about the world of the last 4 decades. And he insisted so much that I did, and I began writing it using what I recalled from what I had lived, as well as documents, original documents that I carried. My wife used to complain that I took boxes from one place to another and saying, when are we going to get rid of these boxes of papers? Well, finally, I put them to good use in this book. The book begins the day of the coup, our 9/11. 9/11/73, when the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende was overthrown by Pinochet and other military leaders. The first phrase of the chapter 1 reads that on 9/11/73, I almost became the first accidental suicide bomber. And that was a phrase that my editor said that I had to put there, because that day, being a young man, I thought that my duty was to defend the constitutional government. And I had received paramilitary training because we were seeing in the horizon the possibility of a military coup. And I went to pick up some dynamite to the house of a friend where we had stashed it away. And I had given him specific instruction on how to store dynamite. He had to turn it around every week so that the sticks of dynamite would not sweat. In other words, the nitroglycerin would not seep out, because otherwise it would become really unstable and it could explode with a movement, in fact. And when I picked it up, the cloth in which the sticks of dynamite were absolutely wet. I imagined that he was so fearful of having the dynamite in his house that he stuck it away and never touched it. And that day I yelled at him, but he was crying because he knew that there was a coup coming and that was changing our lives. So I put the dynamite around my waist together with a .32 caliber gun and went to meet some friends and to see how we would defend the government. The story, you would have to read it for those of you who haven't yet, how it goes. But what I'm trying to say is that we try to resist, but the weapons that were the war weapons that we were supposed to receive that night to resist the coup never arrived, meaning that there was no truly any resistance to the military coup, except for one combat, if you wish, in south part of Santiago. That was it. Only 36 people died the day of the coup, 9/11/73. But by the end of the year, in other words, less than 3 months later, almost 2,000 people had died, assassinated by the Pinochet dictatorship. And this is important because what came was then a reign of terror. Pinochet tried to hold on to assert his power in the country by closing Congress, eliminating all newspapers that were criticized that were democratic, by persecuting anybody who thought it was close to the left or even the center, that had a democratic idea. And that was part of his reasserting his power within the armed forces, because he had not been the original leader of the coup. Others had been the leaders, and he had joined at the last minute. Pinochet was a pragmatist. He was very submissive and obsequious with those above him, so much so that he used to visit on Sundays then Defense Minister Orlando Letelier and have drinks at his house on Sundays and take toys to the kids. And a few years later, he had him assassinated in Washington, D.C. So this was a pragmatist or an opportunist, others would say. And as a pragmatist or an opportunist, there's another dimension of him. And that is that once he took over, he realized that he had to confront the problem of an economy that was in ruins, because the situation in Chile during Allende had polarized, and the economic policy had led to black marketing, to hyperinflation, etc. So he adopted the Chicago School of Economics creed. In fact, Milton Friedman went to Chile and presented him with a plan. And he was a statist. He was an interventionist, a nationalist. But he adopted the monetarist creed because he had no alternative. This was a package that young economists that had gotten their MAs and PhDs at the University of Chicago had, and he had no other choice. And as a pragmatist, he went along with this, even though he never believed, and in fact, he surrounded himself by some military men that were statists and did not believe in the model. But as the model began to control inflation and show its fruits, he began to turn into a true believer. In the meantime, repression was what characterized the country. I tried to survive. Basically, we tried to survive. All the parties, the persecution, the death, the torture, people taking asylum. I never took asylum in an embassy because I felt it was cowardice to do so. And so I stayed and tried to participate in the very weak underground resistance that there was. Until a day when we realized that the situation was grave enough to rethink staying in the country. A couple of years ago, Barbara Walters invited me to her apartment, offered a dinner in my honor, and at dessert, she has a very large round table in her apartment. And the great conversationalist that she is, she posed an issue that she wanted to discuss at dessert. She said, I just seen a movie about the influence of fate or luck in changing people's life. The movie was Match Point by Woody Allen. And how then the luck or fate changes in a major way the life of an individual. And she said, I want to ask each and every one of you, remember an incident where luck or fate changed your life. And don't tell me when you met your spouse, or when your son or daughter was born. No, that's out. And it was very interesting because all kinds of stories came up. And I was the last one because I was sitting to her right. And I told the story when the military went to pick me up. And what I saw was almost a battalion. They blocked the streets, trucks with the military with machine guns and heavy weaponry came to arrest me. And I saw in a truck 2 of my friends who were already arrested. So I knew that they were coming for me because I saw them there from the window of the house of my mother where I was living. So I put on my jacket and I told my wife, who is American, and who's here with me, by the way, I told her, call Ted Kennedy, call your congressman in upstate New York, where she lived at the time, and just make sure they find out where I will be taken prisoner. That's the most important thing, that I do not disappear. And as she paced up and down with her American passport in her hand, I waited for the arrest, and time passed, 15, 20 minutes, and all of a sudden, they left. And I couldn't understand. And a few minutes later, a shaking neighbor who had been friends with my mother for 30 years came in and said, they were coming for you. And I didn't tell them that you live next door. And they made a mistake. They came in the wrong door. And I said, I don't have a son by that name. I have only 2 daughters, and they ransacked my house. And then they were very mad and left. 8 years later, I was in Mexico and saw one of the men who was in that truck. And he embraced me and he cried. And he said that the only, quote unquote, happy moment at that detention had been the fact that the military had gone into the wrong house. And that the captain leading the group was really mad about the bad intelligence he had gotten. I could have gone through what my friends went. They were arrested and taken to the National Stadium, tortured for several months, mock executions, and they ended up in exile. After I told that story, Barbara Walters said, you won, you won, you won. But we thought that perhaps my luck would run out, and we went and hid with my wife for a while until we realized that there was no point in armed resistance to a military dictatorship. And I left the country legally. And when I did my PhD at the University of Denver, at the Graduate School of International Studies, which was a breath of fresh air for me. My classmate and friend was a very important, later on, woman, Condoleezza Rice. And I saw a part of America that was very interesting to me. But I decided that I would go back. And even though I was offered interesting possibilities to remain in the United States, sure enough, in late 1978, I went back with a PhD in my hands, and I thought that that would protect me. But a couple of months later, I was being picked up, put in jail, have a couple of fingers broken, one of which has never healed because I never took care of it well enough, and tried in a major crimes tribunal for insulting General Pinochet and causing public disturbances. In fact, I was absolved temporarily. My case is legally still in court, but it's been such a long time that there's a statute of limitations in Chile too, so I'm off the hook. But the point is that after I went back, the economic model that seemed to be going really well crushed in 1982. And it was something very similar to what has happened in the United States beginning in September of last year. What there was no regulation of the banking system whatsoever. And there was a lot of lending between banks and companies, many of which were almost ghost companies, without any regulation whatsoever. And at that moment, 1982, Paul Volcker was the Fed, and he decided to tighten interest rates in order to control inflation. And then the flow of international financing began to dry up. And Chile's situation, as one of other countries, began to shake. And there was the currency was fixed. The peso was fixed to the dollar. And Pinochet was forced to devaluate, which the Chicago boys, the Chicago School of Economics advisors had said, no, don't do that. And he fired the Chicago boys and put in some neo-Keynesian economists, and he rescued the banking system at the tune of the equivalent of about $25 billion of today's money, which for an economy like Chile's is a lot of money. So we continue paying that for many, many years into the democratic times. In fact, and the banks were nationalized to all intents and purposes. And then regulations were set up so that that would not occur again. But that allowed us the opportunity to mobilize in the opposition as we hadn't before. So we began doing some protests, beginning in 82, 83, banging pots at night, and all of a sudden we found that Chile was uprising peacefully against the dictatorship. However, at the time, the Communist Party had drawn the opposite lesson than some of us had drawn. I was a militant of the Socialist Party. The Communists had thought that, and this was in a party congress in Moscow, in the then Soviet Union, when Brezhnev, at the 25th Party Congress of the Communist Party, said that the Chilean revolution had not been able to defend itself, and any revolution should be able to defend itself. And at the same time, the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. And they had invaded Afghanistan because they had said that they did not want the Chile situation to happen with the Najibullah government, of communist government of Najibullah in Kabul. So that's why they invaded Afghanistan, because they were thinking of Chile. And at the same time, then the Chileans, communists, began developing an armed wing in the party when they had been always the most peaceful, particularly during the Allende time, the most reasonable. They began to develop an armed struggle, and they attempted to assassinate Pinochet, and I give details of a chapter where they tried to assassinate Pinochet because I know one of the persons that participated in that, and other people that were on the side of Pinochet gave me interviews where much details are provided. On the other hand, we had drawn the opposite lesson. We socialists thought, like Italian leader Berlinguer, that the Chilean experience indicated that you had to create a wide coalition, a compromiso histórico, he talked about, a historical compromise between the left and the center. And that was the birth of Eurocommunism at the time. And our lesson was that, yes, that we had to unite with those who had been in opposition to Allende, with the Christian Democrats. And that's what we did. And we began working with them. And finally, in 1988, Pinochet felt so confident once the economic situation had improved after the crash of 82, 83, that he would do a plebiscite to continue on. And it was a very uneven field, of course. No level playing field by any chance. I was invited by the National Democratic Institute to go to Philippines to look at how in the Philippines they had organized a quick count and a polling system to look at to make sure that there wouldn't be fraud. And I went there, we adapted it, we organized ourselves, and we beat Pinochet at his own game. I remember having gone at that time to California to teach briefly a course for 3 months at the University of Southern California, and having written at the request of the Los Angeles Times a piece where I said that we had to participate in the plebiscite. And I gave a lecture at UC San Diego, at La Jolla, and somebody from the audience said that I was basically a traitor because of what I was saying, that we should participate. But since I was going back to be in the front lines, and he was staying in sunny Southern California, I thought that I had a pretty good ethical argument, you know? So, and we won, and that was the opening of democracy. It wasn't the end of Pinochet, because Pinochet wanted to be the power behind the thrones. He felt that the people of Chile would go and look for him because the center and the left governing together were never going to agree on anything, on economic policy or on issues of governance in general. And with free unions, with an open Congress, with free press, etc., criticizing was going to be really difficult to reconstruct and do a transition to democracy. But we succeeded. But he felt he would be like Cincinnatus, the Roman emperor, dictator, who had cleaned up the Roman Empire after a period of upheaval. He went and cultivated his land after that, And then they went to search for him again when the Roman Empire fell into a chaotic period. He felt that they would go and pick him and bring him back to power. It didn't happen, but in his own constitution, he had ensured himself a place in the Senate for forever. It was a life seat. And he loved to travel. After he left the army post, which was several years after, he loved to travel to London, particularly because London, he said, was a place where there were not protesters, there wouldn't be these people talking about human rights, and he could tour and shop at Harrods and go and eat at good places, and nobody would bother him. So happened that he was arrested there at the request of a Spanish judge and remained about a year and a half detained. He was sent to Chile, and finally, for health reasons, he was tried in Chile, and he died in December 2006 when he was under house arrest. He was never condemned for his crimes, though. You may be wondering, and with this I'll end, so what's the role of the United States in all of this? And the role of the United States was absolutely fundamental. Before Allende was elected, the CIA, instructed directly by Nixon, attempted to impede the accession, the inauguration of President Allende. I'm talking about 1970. It did so through two tracks. Buying votes in the Congress had to ratify Allende's direct election. He had won a plurality. And the other through violence, through a military coup, giving weapons and money to a group of thugs, right-wing thugs, both in the army and civilians. It didn't work. But then the Nixon administration began an invisible war, a silent war against Allende. There's a very nice book, by the way, by Robert Dallek called Nixon and Kissinger, where he says something that I fully agree, that Nixon and Kissinger spent so much time on Chile, a relatively small country, at a moment when the agenda, foreign policy agenda of the United States was the war in Vietnam was expanding to Cambodia. The SALT talks were taking place with the Soviet Union to limit nuclear weaponry. The opening to China was taking place. The Middle East war was, as always, hot, but hotter than usual. And there were a bunch of other issues, and nevertheless, in the Oval Office, they were discussing Chile. They were discussing Allende. Right? But the situation was not always linear. The Ford administration, after Nixon, embraced Pinochet. And Pinochet then thought that since there was an embrace of this anti-communist dictator, that he could do what he wanted. And he began a terror campaign, not only within Chile, but outside. Bombings to kill dissidents in Buenos Aires, killings, attempted killings in Rome, and he dared to go to Washington, D.C., and to perpetrate the first terrorist attack on the U.S. continental territory ever, long before the attack on the towers of 1993. And he assassinated then in the streets of Washington, 1 mile from the White House, former ambassador and defense minister Orlando Letelier, and an American colleague who was riding in the car where they put the bomb. And he never realized that any American administration, Republican or Democrat, would never stand for that. So that when the Reagan administration came in, they gave him a chance through quiet diplomacy, which Madam Kilpatrick, a colleague at the UN some while ago, advocated. But when Pinochet did not give any signs of opening and reducing repression, Reagan turned against him. And in fact, Reagan's ambassador in Chile at the time of the plebiscite was not received by Pinochet. He hated him so much. So in the end, the story on the part of Washington was one of support for the struggle at the last stage but a very important support. And interestingly enough, how life is, a committee was constituted in the US Congress, presided by former President Ford and former President Carter, and led by Richard Lugar on the Republican side and Kennedy on the Democratic side, helping us. But the lesson is that sometimes you should be aware and fearful that your wishes may come true. Because in this case, Pinochet came in and it was a creation of a monster. It's like a sorcerer's apprentice when you create something that you cannot control, and a man that then goes out in the world perpetrating terrorist attacks, believing that he's acting under your own ideology and policy. The other lesson is, so did Chile change or not? Yes, it did. I think with Pinochet, there was a sense in Chile that there was an entrepreneurial spirit, the sort of Schumpeterian spirit that did not exist before. Second, there was a control of hyperinflation, even though the results were much better under democracy. Third, there was the idea of discipline and rigor in the management of the economy that continued to be the case. And fourth, an emphasis on exports. Chile could export anything. We used to export only copper that represented 70% of our foreign earnings. Now you're probably consumers of our wine, you're probably consumers of our salmon, of our fresh fruits, particularly in this time of the year, and a bunch of other products, including the Chilean sea bass that I highly recommend. So that was part of the change. But the real miracle occurred in democracy, because we reduced inflation to 1 digit. Pinochet was never able to do it. We received a country in 1990 with 40% poverty. Today it's 13%, and we have practically eliminated absolute poverty. We have reduced, even though not enough, the differences in income through subsidies, etc. We have grown at a rate of about 5.56%, so that we have tripled our GDP in a couple of decades. And in essence, Chile has been a success story. And right now, at this moment, Chile is confronting the international crisis in a much better situation than others. So in my conclusion is that Pinochet will be remembered as I will remember him always, more as a ruthless dictator than as the innovator that changed the Chilean economy, because truly that was done more in the democratic period than under his rule of terror. Thank you. Yes?
Why do you think Pinochet tolerated the political party's continued existence, the opposition before 1998, and even you being able to move freely in and out of the country when the administration must have had some sense that you were up to no good? So
Yeah. Well, at that time, first of all, I was relatively young, and I was not an important leader. So even though I knew I was being followed sometimes, because one time I went to a meeting, and after the meeting had ended, my car, they had broken into my car in the back of the car. They had opened the hood, and I had a case there, a briefcase. They had not taken any documents. I mean, they had not taken any valuables that I had. I had a camera or something else. They had only taken documents. So they had given me the message, we are watching you, basically. There was, but I wasn't an important leader in those times. I became a more relevant leader towards the end of the 80s, when I was member of the executive committee of the No, so that we could move in and out without much problem, because they had other priorities. Particularly because they were after those that still believed that armed struggle could be possible. And I have given up armed struggle in 1977, to be exact, when I was in Denver. And a friend of mine who was an exile, he was member of the MIR, of the Movement of the Revolutionary Left, had invited me to keep my shooting in good shape. And we went to a shooting range with a .45 caliber gun to do some practice shooting. And after that, I thought, this is ridiculous. I've been doing practice target shooting with this gun. And then we went to a Taco Bell to have something, and then I had to go and study because next day I had a test. And that was so ridiculous. So that Pinochet was concentrated on those that he felt were more dangerous than I. At the same time, he had eliminated all the parties, but Chile's society was so developed from the point of view from the civic point of view, that it was very difficult to stop expressions of dissent that were becoming public. At the beginning, up to 1983, it was impossible to do it publicly. You did something, you went to jail. You did not speak in a bus about criticizing the government because you may be arrested. So there was a great deal of fear, and he was a great manipulator of fear. After 1983 is when he begins concentrating on managing the economy, and he leaves spaces then for dissidents to become more and more, I would say, ambitious and daring in the opposition, going out in the street even to oppose him.
Given how important the U.S. was in the dictatorships in South America during the 60s and the 70s, how would you say that the foreign policy of the U.S. has evolved in the past 30 years, especially in the past 8 years, and given the new administration? Sometimes it still seems that the motto of bringing freedom to the world, especially given the crimes that they committed in South America, be it in Chile, Argentina, Brazil, sometimes it still seems a little hypocritical. What's your thought on that?
Well, remember, I'm an ambassador right now. You don't expect me to answer about the last 8 years in a frank way. But let me say the following, that we had major differences with the U.S. administration as regards this idea of regime change, and particularly the war in Iraq. I was in the Security Council for almost 2 years, and our government opposed the idea of invading Iraq because we said that if there were weapons of mass destruction, we had to have evidence. And we had to give the chance to the UN inspectors to truly find those weapons and force Saddam Hussein to have concrete benchmarks to comply so that it wouldn't be open-ended. And if we found, or if they did not comply, we were willing to consider the use of force through a formal resolution of the Security Council, but not outside the Security Council. And the US and Britain disagreed with us. The story is that we were right, and they were wrong. And we said that this was going to be a terrible tragedy, that the country was going to fall apart, that this could be a hotbed of radicalism if the United States invaded. And they told us, you're wrong, this will be over in a couple of months. And we all remember mission accomplished and what followed. So that I saw in the Security Council how the United States said the UN has become irrelevant because it has not lived up to its responsibility, because it did not support the idea of the use of force against Saddam Hussein. And then he went back to the Security Council in sort of a U-turn to say, help us, because when the war began going wrong on the ground and the main actors in Iraq would not speak to Mr. Bremer, who was the American representative, I would only speak to someone from the UN, we had to send envoys, one of whom died in Baghdad in an attack, Sergio Vieira de Mello. And the second one was the one that actually opened the way for the relative institutionalization and calm that you see now in Iraq. Oftentimes, they forget that we were the ones that convinced the Iraqis that there had to be a postponement of the election so that we would organize a good election with electoral rolls, etc., that we helped them draft a constitution, that we observed the elections, and that we risked a lot of the lives of UN staff to do that and further elections that took place later on, and a dialogue among all the sectors in Iraq. So we had a major disagreement with the U.S. As we saw the U.S. changing its opinion and returning to the UN Security Council for help. We disagreed on climate change. We disagreed forcefully on torture because of our experience on human rights and our trajectory on human rights and many other issues. But that's history. And the only thing I can say is that the present administration has been extremely well received in Chile and in Latin America. It is unbelievable. I think that there had been a vote, Obama would have gotten 90% of the vote in Latin America. And the signal he's given so far are very important. And in fact, his first summit will be in April in Trinidad and Tobago with Latin American leaders. So we will see there how things evolve. But indeed, there was, I think, a period, particularly during the last years, where Chile and many other countries in the world did not meet eye to eye with the U.S. Yes, here and there.
I would like to have your thoughts on the different paths that South American countries are heading to. More specifically, we have Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador in one path, and we have countries like Chile, Argentina, Brazil on a different path. Do you have any thoughts on this kind of?
Sure. Well, I saw a couple of years ago, already maybe a year ago, a headline in a newspaper saying Latin America is going red. Actually, I think Latin America has been going into all of the colors of the rainbow. Because if you look at the elections in the last 2 years, 3 years up to now, you have a relatively conservative president elected, Mr. Calderon in Mexico, a sort of centrist, some would say more rightist, Oscar Arias elected in Costa Rica, Ortega elected in Nicaragua, that one would say is left. Then the re-election of Lula, who's a social democrat, a moderate socialist, the election of my president, Bachelet, first time a woman president in Chile and in South America, also a moderate socialist. The re-election, actually the election after many years of a rather conservative Alan Garcia in Peru, the election of Mr. Correa, one would say more left, varieties of populism, with the case of Evo Morales in Bolivia. The election of the president of Paraguay, who's a leftist, but a moderate leftist, and a very moderate leftist in Uruguay. So much so that he opposes abortion, and he has left the Socialist Party of Uruguay because of the differences that he has over abortion with his own party. So that the variety is, I think, what one has to respect. Diversity. That's what is Latin America now. Each country is responsible for the paths to development, to growth. We don't, in the case of Chile, I can only speak for Chile, we don't follow, first of all, we don't have the wallet full of money that Chavez has because of the oil income, even though the oil now has dropped, as we know, for quite a while, but we never thought that it would be up to $120 and more. So that is easier to do the type of policies that he implements with a lot of money. But we'd rather stick with what we're doing, and we will see the results. Venezuela is facing high inflation. The rate of growth is going to be complicated, but it's going to be complicated in all of Latin America. But probably Chile is going to come out much better because after the increase of copper, which continues to be significant, it's about 32% of the foreign currency income, we created 2 sovereign funds, and we have been doing exactly the opposite of what the IMF recommended. The IMF generally recommended that when there is a recession, you tighten your belt. Well, we're not tightening our belt. We're doing exactly the opposite. We're spending more, precisely using that money to activate and stimulate the economy, a bit like the package here. And we have put in, our president has thrown in a package of $4 billion to create jobs, to stimulate the economy, so that we will be growing, I don't know, around 2%. But if you look at Europe, all the minuses that they're going to grow this year, and you look at other countries, we are not in that bad of a shape. So I'd say that there are those differences, but it's more than just, sort of the leftists versus the more conservatives. I think it's a lot more nuanced, and each country is responsible for the leaders they have. Yes.
So maybe bridging off of that question, thinking a little more long-term. So in his book, The End of History, Francis Fukuyama made this assertion that democracy is the end state of government. Mm-hmm. And critics have pointed out that Latin America has flirted with other forms in the last 30 years. So thinking longer term, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that, certainly in Chile, you said that there was a sort of a larger idea in the populace towards democracy. Do you think that other states will fall in place or fall in line in that regard?
Well, first of all, I will not say anything negative about Francis Fukuyama, because on the back of the book, he said something very good about my book. I think he was thinking about the end of history in a different sense, much more complicated. But my feeling is that there is a relentless wave towards democratic rule. And it's not only the experience of Chile, it's because in an interdependent world, because of you, because of Google, because of CNN, instant news, people know what's going on, and a beating and a repression in the farthest corner of the world is known instantly, so that leaders cannot get away with what they got away in the past. And the growth of a human rights community that is extremely active, that many say that was born out of the Chile experience and the solidarity with Chile, makes it so that they become actors that push countries in a way that would have been unthinkable in the past. Then you have the situations like that of Nepal that could have ended up in anything, and there's a democratic government, and there are problems, but there's an elected government. You had a situation like Liberia, which was, terrible. It could have been a humanitarian crisis, and finally you had an election of the first woman president in Africa. So my feeling is that the pursuit of democracy it continues to be a key aspiration of the peoples worldwide. And I don't accept this idea that there are values that are antithetical to democracy and human rights. That is an excuse of those that want to defend authoritarianism. What I think is under question is the issue of what type of capitalism you're going to have, because it's very different. A well-regulated capitalism than a savage, uncontrolled one, as we have seen. So my perception is that we're going to see in the next few years a very substantial change in the economic order. First of all, there's going to be, I think, a new architecture. There's going to be reforms of the World Bank, of the IMF, in a significant way, in my view. And perhaps we're going to have a change in sectors of the economy that will never recuperate the jobs that have been lost, and new sectors will emerge linked to more a green economy, particularly in the developed countries, but even in developing countries as well. So we're before, I think, changes that are beginning to emerge or will slowly emerge in front of our eyes.
Thank you very much again. That was fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you.